Hello? Hello? Well, I feel so honored to be in a room full of architects and designers. In Canada, I work in urban planning, and oftentimes the spaces for planners where we get together to consult and reflect about our practice, there's never any architects or designers. So it's making me think about how fragmented some of our work has become, considering we're all working in the same kinds of spaces and the same conversations. And somehow I feel the pressure being the only Canadian today and the embassy sponsoring this event, so I feel like I have to do a really good job. And I don't know if any of my examples are really Canadian best practices, because I think, as many of you, I feel like a lot of my projects or things that I've been involved with are basically learning processes for myself. And every time I do it, I try and change things and modify things and try and make my work and better. So today I thought I would spend a little bit of time maybe sharing with you, telling you a little bit about an organization called the International Association of Public Participation. I'm a member of this organization, and I've been involved in some of its conferences and the materials it develops to help develop best practices in public participation. Maybe I can share with you some of the core values that are emerging through this organization and helping develop the practice of public participation. We can talk a little bit about decision making in this process, the public participation spectrum and techniques in public participation, and then maybe I can share with you some examples around how we use public participation in technical conversations that maybe are not so design-based, but more of the regulation and policy-based types of requirements that we all need as planners and architects and designers. So maybe we can reflect a little bit about what public participation is. In 1990, a group of practitioners in this sphere of work have gotten together and decided to establish the International Association of Public Participation in order to respond to the increasing demands and interest in this practice of work. So obviously, you as architects, planners, designers are also interested in this type of work, but there's many people in different disciplines engaged in public participation. They say they're the preeminent organization. I'll leave it at that. I'm not sure. It's still very North American and Western based, but slowly affiliations around the world are connecting with this group and also expanding that space for talking about public participation. The working definition used by this organization is involve those who are affected by a decision in the decision-making process. So it's a very broad definition. And basically, one of the attributes or the qualities of this is that it's a political principle. It may be recognized as a right in some conversations and spaces. And basically, it's increasingly becoming an essential tool in the process of democracy and governance. Here's a quotation from someone who's participated in an open house and said, basically, I believe I have a right to provide input into decisions or actions that affect me, my children, and my money. Very practical response, right? And so public participation helps to promote more sustainable decisions. It also contributes to the resiliency of our communities, our neighborhoods, our cities, and our countries. Provides participants with the information they need. So even though we're engaging people in public participation, we're also required to give them the information they need to make these decisions. Objective, transparent information. And it also communicates how their information will be used. And so if we say we're using their information to make such a decision, we have to follow through with that commitment. So what is public participation? What degree, what university can you go, or what diploma can you get in this? Well, you really can't, because it's kind of it's a core competency that's emerging from a variety of different disciplines. from people in communication, people who do public relations, people in HR development and organizational development, practitioners in mediation, conflict resolution, negotiation, facilitation, and then increasingly people like us, planners, designers, architects, even public administrators in local government are learning about this process, and even engineers. So we also have to recognize that public participation and all the decision making around it is values-based. So within this process, we all come in with a set of values, assumptions, thoughts, and we always have to keep reflecting on what are these values? What are the values of the organization we're working in? What are the values of the community? So because these values affect how people perceive the decision, what they think about this decision, what is the outcome of the decision. It also affects whether or not they participate or not in the engagement or the process. It's about trust. You know, if they've participated in one activity and at the end they feel like, oh, nothing's really happened, I've participated, but everything I said was somehow dismissed, maybe I won't come again to another conversation. And then it leads to the outcomes of how effective our participation actually is. We also have to, in public participation, the discourse is also emerging around that it has to be decision-oriented. There's a purpose to this public participation, that there's a scope of issues that are under conversation. And it has to come to a conclusion or a decision within a specific process. But of course, the process continually evolves. Sometimes for me as a practitioner, I get very frustrated because public participation tends to be very project-driven. So here we have this project, we have this issue, and we're going to decide here, we've done our open house, our open space, our charrette, and then we're finished. And then we move on to the next project. So for me, it's a place to really reflect on, is this an attitude, a posture, a quality, kind of a way of being or functioning as organizations or institutions, or is it just a project-based activity that we've checked off a box? And I think we need to really reflect on those two kinds of positions. And that public participation is goal-driven. It also has, it outlines what the public's role is in this decision-making and what their influence will be on the issues and the decisions and what the objectives will be. And sometimes we're not always very clear in how we articulate this. I've been in a number of public meetings and, we were trying to find out about issue A, and then everything we present or talk about is about issue B. And then people feel like they're confused about what is the message, what is the conversation, and really what their input is being used for. So some of the core values that the IAP2 is trying to also encourage and develop is this idea that those people who are affected by the decision have the right to participate in the decision. Also that we make a promise that their input will affect the outcome. And if we promise that, we really need to think about what is it that we're doing, what systems in place have we put in to really integrate their input. Do the people making the decisions actually, have they read any of the public input? Because as administrators or architects or designers, we're out there in the field, but we're not making the decision, somebody else is. And have they seen what has been talked about? Do they understand the issues? It promotes more sustainable decisions by recognizing the needs and the interests of the participants. So really knowing your community, your population, what are their aspirations? How do they participate? When's a good time? I remember once I worked for a municipality, they really wanted a new zoning bylaw updated and reviewed, and they said 10 months. And we're starting in February, and we want this approved by November. And 90% of the people in their community are farmers, and the time we wanted to go talk to the community was when they were seeding their fields, and they had no time. They said the best time will be 4 in the morning. And it made us really rethink, okay, well, who is it that we're talking to, and why are we talking to them? So it also, you design the project based on the population. It provides information they need and so that they can participate in a meaningful way. Because also as a public, people have a responsibility to know about the issues that we're talking about. You know, we had this pre-workshop on Tuesday. It was very informative for me. And, you know, we all know armchair experts. Everybody who always sits on the sidelines has lots to say, but never really gets into the meat and the difficult conversations that need to happen. And it also communicates, and we clearly communicate how your information will be used to make this decision. So here's a quick and dirty summary of normally what's involved in designing a public participation process. It requires a lot of upfront thought and investigation and research and conversations. So when that event does happen, or the activity or whatever the technique being used is implemented, there's been a lot of work done ahead of that and in advance of it in order for it to come to fruition. So first of all, you have to come up with a plan of what you're going to do, and then in parallel have a communication plan. And these are two different activities. Oftentimes we confuse these two processes, and we kind of mangle them up all in one. But really a communication plan is another objective, another purpose. It's a parallel process that should be an outcome of whatever your public participation strategy or plan is. First of all, you need to gain an internal commitment. Before any organization or group wants to engage with the public, everybody in the organization is committed and on board. You can't have one group of people in an organization doing something and another one thinking completely different. So a lot of work needs to be done internally to ensure that everybody has the same vision in mind. Otherwise, it just creates roadblocks and creates ineffective processes. Then the second step is to learn from the public. What is our community like? Who are they? What kinds of attributes are characteristic of their lifestyle? What's important to them? Will they come out to a meeting at 7 p.m. when they are doing other things? So we really need to understand the population we're working with. Thirdly, then you start thinking about okay, at what level are we including people in this decision making? And then in the next slides, I'll talk a little bit more about selecting the level of participation. What are we willing as organizations to basically allow people to do? Because that's the posture we're coming in from. How open are we actually to meaningfully allow people to participate in decision making? And then we define what the decision scope is and what the objectives are. And then we finally design our process that we are going to learn from, including how we're going to evaluate if what we've done has been effective, if it actually was meaningful, how is this information being used, and what are we then communicating back to the community. So basically, the International Association has created this spectrum of involvement. And this is part of that step 3. So basically, they're trying to learn from, what level of involvement do people have in decision making. And many of us are probably quite familiar with a level of involvement where we just inform the public of our decision or what we're doing. So this is normally done with, some newspaper ads. We might send some household flyers. We might put an ad in the paper. And that's about it. And then sometimes people call that public participation. The second level is consult. So here we're going to ask people about some information, and then we'll consider your information in the decision to some degree. The next level is to really involve them. It's a two-way conversation. So we may ask some questions, but the public may also pose some other questions and concerns. The third level, or the fourth level, is collaborating together. So we're using techniques and processes where we actually are maybe co-creating ideas. And then finally, real deep public participation is when we actually empower people to make the decisions that affect them. And so we have to be mindful of, okay, where are we comfortable, and how, as an organization or individuals, and how do we keep moving us towards this empowerment level on the spectrum? So the more we move to the your right, the more power the community is given to make the decisions. But how we decide that depends on values, on the goals that are being achieved, and also what the objectives of the project are. So here we're talking about, a three-step process, and then finally you decide what technique. So one technique we've heard quite a bit this morning was about co-design and maybe charrette types of activities. So in this process, you're selecting techniques, and there's so many different ways of engaging the public in a conversation. One is one of the lowest level of technique, which is along the inform and consult level on the spectrum, is sharing information. So maybe awareness campaigns, information education programs. Then as you move towards the right of the spectrum, you're going to actually collect and compile input. Maybe through some interviews, maybe through some surveys. And then finally, techniques around bringing people together and actually cross-pollinating information and conversation. So you might want to have open public forums with conversation spaces. And so you can see in that image above how the three different types of techniques differ. And there's so many different techniques of public participation, and it all depends on what your objectives are. So you could have symposiums, you could have charrettes and co-design workshops, you could have town hall meetings. Now we have technology-aided tools where you have SurveyMonkey, you have scenario planning, even gaming that will help the community learn about possible futures and maybe how they would like those futures realized. There's common forms, surveys, interviews, deliberative conversations. There's so many different techniques, but all of them relate to what your objectives are in your public participation process. So I thought I would share with you how we designed a public participation type of process with the stakeholders and the public for designing a zoning bylaw. This is on the top right. You see normally many of you in your communities have these big binders full of regulations and policies, and it has setbacks and how many meters everything has to be far from a property line. And then you have probably a map illustrating these zones in your municipality of, what's residential, what's commercial, what's industrial. And in this case, we were focusing on specific regulations related to landscaping and density. So here you go. Here's some typical examples from our part of the world of landscaping for new development. You've got some trees, some paved surface, some grass. So all of this is all written in this zoning bylaw, and it becomes basically kind of the planner's Bible for approving a development project. And then density, right? I found online, this was my best effort to show kind of density and how it progresses from, a single family residential area to a more complex high density residential area. Okay, so we had to go back to think about, what are our objectives of this project? And when we started meeting with the municipality, we started to explore, what are the decisions involved in creating a zoning bylaw? And we had to think about, is this something that matters to people, and who does this matter to? So who should be at the table around this conversation? What are the challenges and opportunities in this conversation? So we had a lot of conversations and process around, what are really the issues around these concepts of density and landscaping standards and density in the zoning bylaw. And then we had to understand, we're planners or designers or engineers, we understand this language, but who else understands this language? How do we present this information to the community so that they can participate? Because these people are from a wide range of backgrounds and histories. And then we were also trying to learn about, well, what would they be interested in? What is, from a perspective of a stakeholder, what is it that they want to receive through this process? Because we often go to public participation exercises and think about what we need, but what is it that the public also needs through this process? And then we also started to think about, well, what are the givens and constraints? Yes, we have the ideal world of what we would like, but then we also have the reality of municipalities, councils, politics, economics, and what is reasonable that we can help advance understanding around public participation and this topic within the community. So basically, here are some of the variables that we had to work with, that this was a strategic update. So sometimes we went to a meeting and people said something else in the bylaw that they had problems with, and we had to say, thank you, that's an important issue, but really we're only talking about this, this, and this today. And that's the only place where we can make decisions about in this conversation. So we don't want to create unrealistic expectations of the public and not being authentic to the process. We also had to understand that these small things like landscaping standards and density have big economic, social, design, and environmental infrastructure impacts for the community. I, as a planner, am not an expert in any of these topics. I understand maybe my little sphere of planning and a little bit about the process, but really, I don't understand the environmental impacts, the infrastructure impacts, economic, micro, macro. We need a lot more people at the table talking about this issue. The municipality had some experience with one-way communication techniques and social media. So we were thinking as planners, okay, well, can we collaborate with stakeholders and come up with more, giving them more empowerment to make certain decisions on some of the regulations? But we realized the municipality really hasn't done this very much before. So it's unrealistic for us to think that we could take a municipality who's had only some experience with sending out newsletters and having a Facebook page and really push them to the other extreme on the spectrum. So we had to think this is a long-term process. It may take hundreds of years as a society, but how can we move understanding around this topic further along this continuum? And we also quickly collaborated with the communication staff to help them understand what we're doing, why we're doing this. And so they understood that when we designed this public participation plan, they were able to communicate the right things, because oftentimes organizations have many masters and everybody's saying something else. So how can everybody be on the same page? And basically, after all this conversations around our plan, we realized that the municipality was okay with maybe doing some informing, a little bit of consulting, and maybe involving the public in some of the decisions. So that's what we had to work with. Overall, this is kind of where we ended up on the spectrum. And so here, we ended up using tons of different techniques. We used open houses. We used stakeholder surveys. We used workshops where we created design books and discussion guides in detail to help also educate the community. We also included information sessions. We used voting techniques. We used online is this a SoundCloud? Where we broadcast radio podcasts to the community. So basically, we did not use one technique in this process. We used many techniques over 18 months. And it kept going in a feedback loop with the community. And so my takeaways is that we need to use these plans in advance so we understand everybody's on the same page. We continually have to reevaluate our process. So even when we start on a plan, we have to readjust things as issues come up and how we respond to them. It always costs more than we think when we start, that we have to have the right resources, so we have to all have the same vision in mind. And also, just because people don't show up to a meeting doesn't mean that they're okay with the issue or the decision. So then we have to rethink, how do we get more people to the table? Thank you.
Thank you, Karolina, very much.